The first bang was a deep, guttural thud that vibrated through the very soul of the aircraft. It was followed by a sickening lurch to the left, sending coffee cups and laptops skittering across the cabin. A collective gasp, sharp and terrified, was the only sound for a moment, a prelude to the screams that erupted when the second bang, louder and more final than the first, echoed from the right side. The reassuring drone of the engines vanished, replaced by an unnerving, whistling silence. The plane, a colossal metal bird, was now just a glider, and everyone on board knew it. The nose dipped, and the world outside the windows tilted at an angle that defied physics and prayer. Panic, a wild and contagious beast, began to claw its way down the aisle. Then, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, stretched thin with a terror he couldn't conceal. "May I have your attention? We have experienced a dual-engine failure." A fresh wave of shrieks answered him. "Is there a pilot on board? Any commercial or military pilots? Please identify yourselves to the cabin crew immediately. This is an emergency." In seat 14C, an old man stirred. He had been looking out the window, his expression not of fear, but of a deep, weary concentration, as if he were listening to a language only he could understand. He wore a simple, navy blue windbreaker over a faded plaid shirt. His hands, gnarled with age and spotted with liver spots, rested calmly on his knees. He slowly, deliberately, unbuckled his seatbelt. The young flight attendant, Sarah, was trying to maintain a brave face, her voice trembling as she repeated instructions for passengers to brace. She saw the old man stand and immediately moved to intercept him, her hands outstretched. "Sir, please, you must return to your seat and buckle up. We are in an emergency." The man didn't look at her with fear or confusion. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were startlingly clear and direct. They held a stillness that was jarringly out of place amidst the chaos. "The captain asked for a pilot," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was surprisingly steady. Sarah shook her head, her own fear making her impatient. "Sir, I understand, but this is not the time. Please, for your own safety." He simply stepped around her, his movements slow but unervingly certain. He didn't grab onto the seats for balance as the plane shuddered. His center of gravity seemed rooted to the floor. Other passengers watched him, a mixture of annoyance and morbid curiosity on their faces. Who was this old man, shuffling toward the cockpit as if he were going to the restroom? Just then, the cockpit door flew open and Captain Mark Evans burst out. He was young, probably not yet 30, with a jaw that was usually set with confident arrogance, but was now slick with a sheen of cold sweat. His eyes were wide, darting around the cabin like a cornered animal. Did anyone respond? "I need someone who knows a yoke from a rudder, now." He spotted the old man making his way forward, and his face contorted with disbelief and fury. "You? What do you think you're doing? Get back to your seat, old-timer. I need a real pilot, someone current, not some relic who thinks he can fly a 787 because he once flew a Piper Cub." The old man stopped just a few feet from him. He didn't react to the insults. He just looked at the captain, his pale eyes seeming to assess every frayed nerve, every trembling fiber of the young man's being. "What's your altitude, airspeed, and current glide ratio, son?" he asked, his voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of whimpering passengers. Captain Evans scoffed, a hysterical sound that was half laugh, half sob. "My situation is that I'm in a 300-ton paperweight falling out of the sky over the Rockies, and I don't have time to play 20 questions with a passenger having a geriatric crisis. Now sit down before I have you restrained." The plane dropped suddenly, a gut-wrenching plunge of 100 feet that stole the breath from everyone's lungs. Evans stumbled, catching himself on the bulkhead, his face ashen. The old man, however, barely shifted, his worn leather shoes planted firmly on the carpet. He seemed to anticipate the movement, swaying with it like a sailor on a familiar deck. "You're fighting the turbulence," the old man stated, not as a question, but as a diagnosis. "You're trying to correct with the yoke, but you're just bleeding off what little energy you have left. You need to trim for best glide speed and let the aircraft settle. She wants to fly, even without power. You just have to let her." Evans stared, his mouth agape. The technical accuracy of the statement, delivered with such profound calm, momentarily short-circuited his panic. It was textbook knowledge. Yes, But the old man spoke of the plane as if it were a living creature he knew intimately. The captain shook his head, trying to reclaim his authority. I know how to fly my plane. I don't need a lecture from the gallery. But his voice lacked conviction. He was lost, and the quiet confidence of this stranger was both infuriating and, terrifyingly, a little bit reassuring. He was a child flailing in deep water, and this old man was speaking to him from the shore. A man in a crisp, blue uniform stood up from seat 8A. He was an Air Force major, his insignia gleaming on his shoulders. He had been watching the exchange, his brow furrowed in a look of dawning recognition. There was something about the old man's posture, the economy of his movement, the unshakable core of authority in his voice. It was the bearing of a command pilot, an aura that no amount of age or civilian clothing could ever fully disguise. Captain Evans, the major said, his voice resonating with parade ground precision. Evans, startled by the new interruption, whipped his head around. What now? Are you a pilot? The major shook his head. No, sir. I fly a desk at the Pentagon. But I strongly suggest you listen to this man. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the tense air. You are, unless I am very much mistaken, speaking to Colonel Joseph Callahan. The name meant nothing to most of the passengers, but to Captain Evans, it was like a physical blow. His blood ran cold. He stared at the old man, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a confused senior, but as something else entirely. The faded windbreaker, the wrinkled face, it all seemed to recede, replaced by a ghost of a different man in a flight suit. Callahan, Evans whispered, the name tasting like ash and reverence in his mouth. Deadeye Callahan? The major nodded grimly. The same. State Route 71 Blackbird. Test pilot at Edwards. He wrote the book on unpowered high-altitude landings. Literally. It's required reading at the academy. Chapter 4 is titled Graceful Brick Management. The cabin, which had been a cacophony of fear, fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The only sound was the wind screaming past the fuselage. Every pilot in the modern world knew the legend of Deadeye Callahan. He was a phantom from the Cold War, a man who flew higher and faster than anyone in history. A man who had dead-sticked experimental aircraft from the edge of space more times than most pilots had made routine landings. He was less a man and more a myth, a figure spoken of in hushed, awestruck tones in flight simulators and officers' clubs. And he was standing right here, in the aisle of a dying passenger jet. Evans felt the world tilt on its axis, a shift far more profound than the plane's dangerous banking. He looked at Colonel Callahan, at the calm, patient eyes, and felt a wave of shame so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He had called this legend Grandpa. He had threatened to restrain him. The sheer, monumental arrogance of his own actions crashed down upon him. The colonel hadn't even blinked. He had absorbed the insults with the same quiet dignity with which he was now facing impending death. Callahan's gaze remained fixed on the young captain, not with triumph or an I told you so smugness, but with a simple, profound expectation. He was waiting. Your instruments are telling you one story, Captain, Callahan said, his voice still low and even. They're telling you about glide paths calculated in a sterile simulator. I'm telling you about the air. It's not empty space. It's a living river, full of currents and eddies. There's a severe mountain wave downdraft pushing you toward that granite ridge to your port side. Your avionics can't see it, but I can feel it through the soles of my feet. You have maybe 90 seconds to make a hard right bank and find the updraft on the leeward side of that smaller peak. If you don't, we're all going to be a smear on a mountainside. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word was a steel girder, building a bridge from certain death to a sliver of hope. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command born from a lifetime spent at the razor's edge of possibility. Evans swallowed hard, his bravado stripped away, leaving only the raw, terrified core of a young man in way over his head. He looked from Callahan's ancient, knowing eyes to the closed cockpit door, behind which his first officer was likely fighting the same losing battle he had been. He made the only decision that mattered. He stepped aside, his body language a portrait of complete and utter surrender. The cockpit is yours, Colonel, he said, the words feeling inadequate small. Callahan gave a single, sharp nod. He walked past Evans and into the cockpit without a backward glance. The first officer, a young man named David, looked up, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Mark, what the hell is?" He trailed off as he saw the old man move with impossible grace into the captain's seat. Callahan didn't bother with introductions. His hands moved over the console, not with frantic haste, but with an eerie, unhurried precision. He ignored the blaring alarms and flashing red lights. His fingers danced across the controls, flicking switches, adjusting trim wheels, his movements economical and fluid. He was like a concert pianist sitting down at a familiar instrument. "Give me manual control." "Disengage the autopilot entirely," Callahan commanded. David, stunned but recognizing the voice of true authority, immediately complied. "It's all yours, sir." Callahan's hands gently took the yoke. He closed his eyes for a brief second, and the entire cockpit seemed to grow quiet around him. It was as if he were merging with the machine, feeling the flow of the wind over the wings, sensing the strain on the airframe not through gauges, but through his very bones. "There," he murmured, almost to himself. He banked the massive plane hard to the right, a maneuver so aggressive that it felt like the wings might shear off. In the cabin, passengers were pressed hard against their seats, but no one screamed. They were all listening, trusting the silence from the cockpit. They were trusting the legend. Outside the window, the jagged, snow-dusted peak that had been filling their view slid away. For a terrifying moment, the plane seemed to fall even faster, dropping toward a dark, pine-covered valley. Then, a tremor ran through the aircraft. It wasn't the violent shudder of turbulence, but a smoother, more powerful sensation. A lift. "We've caught it," Callahan said, his voice laced with the faintest hint of satisfaction. "The mountain wave updraft. It'll give us another 10,000 feet of altitude to play with. Now, find me a place to land this thing." David's hands flew over the navigation displays, his panic replaced by a focused, adrenaline-fueled purpose. He was no longer a co-pilot. He was the student of a master. "Sir, there's nothing. No airports within glide range. It's all mountains and forest." Callahan didn't look at the screen. He was looking out the front window, his gaze sweeping across the landscape below. "An airport is a luxury, son. We're not looking for luxury. We're looking for survival. Look for a highway. A long, straight stretch of concrete. Something flat." David zoomed in the map. There's an interstate, sir. I-70. About 15 miles east. A straight section running through a valley. That's our runway," Callahan declared. For the next 10 minutes, he was a maestro conducting a symphony of physics and sheer willpower. He flew the 787 not like a commercial airliner, but like the unpowered gliders he had tested in the Mojave Desert decades ago. He used S-turns to bleed off speed without losing too much altitude, his control inputs so subtle they were almost invisible. He was coaxing the wounded bird home, whispering to it in a language of pressure and airflow. "Gear down," he commanded. The rumble of the landing gear extending was the most beautiful sound anyone on that plane had ever heard. Below them, the interstate highway stretched out like a gray ribbon. Cars, looking like tiny toys, were scattering as their drivers realized a Boeing 787 was using their lane for its final approach. "This is going to be rough," Callahan said, his knuckles white on the yoke. "Hold on." The plane skimmed over the treetops, the silent descent an eerie spectacle. The ground rushed up to meet them. With a final, delicate flare, Callahan eased the massive aircraft down. The rear wheels touched the pavement with a screech of tortured rubber, then the nose wheel. The plane bounced once, hard, then settled, roaring down the highway, shedding pieces of its landing gear as it scraped along the concrete. Callahan used the rudder and emergency brakes with surgical precision, keeping the aircraft straight as it decelerated with violent force. It finally shuddered to a halt, its nose cone less than 50 yards from an overpass. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the ragged, gasping breaths of 200 souls who had been delivered from death. Then, the cabin erupted. It wasn't screams of terror anymore, but a tidal wave of cheers, sobs, and shouts of pure, unadulterated joy. The emergency slides deployed, and the passengers evacuated onto the bizarre, surreal landscape of a major highway littered with stunned motorists. Fire trucks and ambulances were already screaming toward them. Captain Mark Evans was one of the last to leave the plane. He found Colonel Callahan not in the cockpit, but standing on the asphalt, looking back at the aircraft with a quiet, contemplative expression. The setting sun glinted off the fuselage, making the crippled giant look strangely peaceful. Evans approached him, his feet feeling heavy. The arrogance he had worn like a uniform was gone, stripped away by the raw terror and profound humility of the last hour. He was just a man, a young pilot who had been shown the vast, immeasurable gap between competence and mastery. "Colonel," he began, his voice cracking. I don't know what to say. I was arrogant, disrespectful. I almost killed us all because I couldn't see past your age." Callahan turned to him, his pale blue eyes holding no trace of anger or resentment. He looked tired, but deeply serene. "You were scared, son. Fear makes fools of us all. The important thing isn't how you acted when you were scared. It's what you did next." "I gave up," Evans said, shamefaced. "I gave you my plane." "No," Callahan corrected him gently. "You didn't give up. You did the hardest thing a captain can ever do. You set aside your pride for the sake of your passengers and your crew. You accepted help. That's not weakness, Captain. That's the very definition of command." He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. It felt surprisingly strong. "You're going to face a lot of questions. Investigations. They'll probably praise you as a hero. But you and I will know the truth of it. Learn from it. Let it make you a better pilot. A better man." He then looked back at the plane, a soft smile touching his lips. "She's a good bird. Flew like a dream, even when she was dying." With that, he turned and began to walk slowly toward one of the arriving emergency vehicles, his shuffle no longer looking like a sign of frailty, but like the measured gait of a man who had walked away from death so many times it had become an old, familiar acquaintance. Mark Evans watched him go, a living legend disappearing into a crowd of uniforms, ready to become just another old man in a windbreaker again. And in that moment, Evans understood that the sky was full of pilots, but very few true airmen, and he had just been saved by the greatest of them all.